7. "Here, kitty, kitty," called the doctor warily, pushing open Etta's front door a few inches and poking his head round the gap. In a slightly guilty way, he was feeling pleased with himself. Unable to use his sonic screwdriver for fear of alerting the Havoken to his presence, he had gained access to Etta's house with nothing more than a bit of wire and his Alpha Centauri Table Tennis Club membership card. His housebreaking skills were a bit rusty, but he had managed to get the door open in just under 7 seconds. Now all he had to do was get past the army of vicious hellcats, and he was laughing. Although he had confidently told Etta that the cats would be back to normal this morning, the doctor had no way of knowing whether that was actually true, beyond doing what he was doing now. If screaming balls of fur with glowing green eyes suddenly came flying at him from all directions, he'd conclude that he'd been wrong and leg it out of there. He looked left and right and even above his head, but all seemed quiet. "Ah, K9, he murmured. "Where are you when I need you?" Then a grey cat slunk through the partly open kitchen door at the end of the corridor beside the central staircase and came padding towards him. The doctor scrutinised it as it approached. It had that serenely disdainful catty swagger about it, and its eyes, though green, were not glowing. The doctor stepped into the house and pushed the door closed behind him. Still watchful, he crouched down and let the cat come to him. It slunk around his ankles a couple of times, then rubbed its face against his knee. He picked it up. "Are you all right now?" he murmured, examining it. He stroked it, and it began to purr. "Word of advice," he said. "If you ever get invited to a fancy dress party, don't go as a nun." He put the cat down, and it sauntered away. Still looking around, the doctor crossed to the wooden door in the panelling that led to the cellar. He could feel the energy in the air with every step he took. It tingled in his skin, vibrated in his nerve endings. Although she didn't know it, Etta and her family had been living slap-bang on top of a vast source of alien power for the past couple of 100 years. It was a bit like living on the summit of a simmering volcano. It had been dormant for the most part, but now it was powering up, getting ready to tear a great big hole out of the planet. Pulling open the wooden door, the doctor went down into the cellar. He crossed straight to the trap door he had asked Etta about last night and tugged it open. A sour-sweet smell wafted up at him, together with a surge of energy so strong it made his flesh tighten, his eyes water, and his hair stand up in punky spikes. "Ooh, talk about overdoing it with the aftershave," he said, and backed away, rubbing his face vigorously with his hands, running his tongue over his itchy teeth. When the energy had dispersed a little, he approached the open trapdoor again. Beneath it, just as Etta had said, was a square storage space about chest height, lined in sheets of metal to make it impervious to rodents and other pests. It was empty now, aside from the lingering ghosts of long-ago fruit harvests. The doctor jumped down into the hole, his feet clanging on the metal floor. He had a theory, and he wanted to test it out. He knew, or at least suspected, that the Havoken could not have survived all this time, even in their dormant state, without help. He ran his hands over the metal walls of the storage chamber, probing for gaps, searching for a dodgy hinge, a hidden catch, anything. It didn't take him long to find it. A loose rivet at the top of the right-hand wall. He pressed it confidently, and nothing happened. Nonplussed, he tried twiddling it, and a metal door about 1 metre square swung open to the side of him. "Now, that's what I call a cat flap," he muttered, and rummaged in his pocket until he found a pencil torch. He turned it on and shone it into the darkness beyond the door. The light revealed a narrow tunnel, the walls roughly clad in rotting timber. "Ready or not, here I come," he said, and clamping the torch between his teeth, he crawled inside. The walls were writhing around her. The ceiling was undulating above her head. Even the floor was rippling beneath her feet. Martha's entire surroundings were made up of black roots or vines, which were constantly on the move, twisting and intertwining like a chamber of snakes. She might have thought they were snakes. if it wasn't for the fact that the green light was pulsing and flickering through them, bathing the place in a dim, toxic glow. Indeed, the only thing that wasn't moving in the hellish environment was Martha herself. She was immobile, her muscles locked into place, able to do nothing but think and observe. She was trying to stay calm, to behave as the doctor would behave, to look around with interest and curiosity. She was trying to overcome the fact that she was terrified out of her wits, trying to tell herself that the reason she kept stepping back into the TARDIS was precisely so that she could have experiences like this. I mean, she thought, here I am in an alien base. Anyway, here I am, and I'm surrounded by giant skinny pumpkin men. I mean, how amazing is that? The pumpkin men, she knew, were called Havoken. She knew that because she could understand their language, even though it was composed not of traditional speech, but of a complicated fusion of chants and movements and little rituals. Thanks to the TARDIS, she understood the Havoken's body language, their facial expressions, even their silences. She knew that they were wary of the Doctor, that they considered him dangerous simply because of the technology they had detected him using. She was aware, too, that they knew he was different to the other inhabitants of the planet because he had... She wasn't sure exactly what word they used here, either because there wasn't an English equivalent of it, or because their language was so alien and ancient that even the TARDIS struggled to translate it. But the closest she could get to it was aura. They considered the Doctor dangerous because he had an aura about him. When Martha heard the Havoken talking about her, she tried not to look alarmed or interested, tried not to let on that she knew what they were saying. They talked about her as a hostage, as a bargaining tool. She knew that they had taken her in the belief that the Doctor wouldn't move against them whilst they had her in their clutches. Wrong, she thought. OK, so she knew the Doctor would back off if they threatened to kill her, but that didn't mean he'd sit on his bum and do nothing. All the time she was here, he'd be beavering away somewhere, thinking of ways to stop them if they needed stopping, or help them if they needed helping. Martha was trying to store it all up, trying to remember all the things she had seen and heard in case it proved useful later. She had learned that the Havoken's power reserves were low, and that even with the Necris, which was the book on top of the plinth thing in the centre of the room, there was now barely enough left to channel their psychic energy. Paralysing all the people in the diner while they had grabbed her had taken a lot out of them, and they needed a temporary power boost to keep things ticking over. Without it, she translated it as Sky Heart, though took it to mean the place they were currently standing in, the Sky Heart would slip back into dormancy, forcing the Havoken once again into hibernation. Works for me, she thought, though in truth, she knew that that would only be pushing the problem underground for future generations to cope with, kind of like burying nuclear waste. She watched as the Havoken gathered round the Necris and began to chant, their soft, childlike voices making Martha feel woozy, although not in a good way. Theirs was a lullaby that promised terrible nightmares rather than sweet dreams. The Havoken sketched symbols in the air with their hideous fingers. The one she took to be their leader simply because he, or was it a she, Martha had no idea, seemed to initiate everything, produced some kind of powder or dust, apparently from nowhere, and scattered it in a ritualistic pattern. One of the Havoken stepped forward and placed a hand on the Necris. Instantly, all the bubbles of green light that flickered and flashed intermittently along the writhing vines seemed to rush towards the centre of the chamber, to gather at the base of the plinth and flow upwards. The Havoken, with its hand on the book, became bathed in green light. It opened its wide mouth and hissed, reminding Martha oddly of a man stepping into a warm shower after a hard day's work. The light enveloped the Havoken completely, filling its deep-set eyes and the black, jagged crack of its mouth, until it looked more like a Halloween pumpkin than ever. And then, fizzing like a soluble aspirin dropped into water, the alien faded away. In the tunnel, the Doctor felt the hairs rising on the nape of his neck. He held out his left hand and saw the hairs stiffening, standing to attention. He sucked his index finger and held it up, as though to gauge the wind direction. "Frying tonight," he murmured. "Definitely on the right track." He crawled on. Panting and sweating, Rick, Scott and Thad were helping to carry lengths of timber and unwanted items of furniture from the big woodshed on the edge of Juniper Park to the growing pyramid of flammable material which would form the Pumpkin Man's funeral pyre at the climax of tonight's festivities. The fire was a Blackwood Falls Halloween tradition. Nobody knew who had started it or where it had come from, but every year the townsfolk made a pumpkin man out of paper and straw, sticks and old clothes, which was placed on top of the fire and burned to ashes. Rick knew the British had something along the same lines, where they burned an effigy of some guy who had tried to blow up their parliament. He didn't think that happened on Halloween night, though, and he didn't think the British burned their guy for the same reason the townsfolk of Blackwood Falls burned their pumpkin man, which was to ward off evil spirits and keep the town safe for another year. It was a long walk from the woodshed to the bonfire site, all the way past the bleachers and the baseball diamond, the carnival marquee and the stalls set up either side of it in a kind of giant horseshoe shape. And by 10:30 a.m, the boys were ready for a rest. Rick's dad, who was helping to build the bonfire itself, dressed in construction worker's hard hat and canvas gloves, put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a $10 note. "Good work, boys. I think you've earned yourselves a soda," he said, handing Rick the money. The boys thanked him. "Is it okay if we have a look round before we come back, Dad? See how things are shaping up?" Rick asked. "Yeah, we need to pace ourselves, Mr. Pirelli," said Scott, palming sweat from his shiny red face. "Otherwise we'll be beat by lunchtime." Tony Pirelli grinned. "Sure, guys. Take a break. Come back when you're ready. This isn't an obligation, you know. Any help you give will be gratefully received." "Oh, we'll be back, Dad. We like helping, don't we, guys? It's all part of the fun." Scott and Thad both nodded. "I wish your brother felt the same way," Mr. Pirelli said with a frown. "Maybe Chris will be along later," said Rick. "Yeah," said Mr. Pirelli flatly. "Maybe." The boys wandered back through the mist-shrouded park, eager to check out how the other preparations were coming along. The red and white striped marquee had been erected a couple of days previously, as had the Halloween Carnival banner over the park entrance. The rides were being set up over on the football field, but most of the current action was focused on the stalls radiating out from the central marquee. Each stall fell roughly into one of three categories: games, food, and stuff to buy. The games were fun but simple affairs: coconut shy, tombola, hook a duck. The food comprised everything from hot dogs and fries to candy and cakes. And the stuff to buy was mainly second-hand or homemade: jewellery, books, t-shirts, and little knickknacks that you'd pick up because they were cute, then throw in the trash a week later. Every year since they had been old enough to help, and Rick's dad, who was on the town's activities committee, had first brought Rick and his friends along to the showground when they were 6 or 7 years old, the boys had walked the walk on the morning before the carnival itself, drinking in the atmosphere, revelling in the anticipation of what was to come. This year, though, was kind of different. Maybe it was the mist, but there was a flatness in the air, a sense of, not doom exactly, but foreboding. People seemed edgy, preoccupied. There was none of the usual laughing and joking and good-hearted banter. "Do you think it's true what that doctor guy said?" Scott asked cautiously. Rick and Thad both looked at him. This was the first time any of them had referred to the events of yesterday afternoon, when the weird guy who turned up in Harry Hose had accompanied them to Rick's house, only to find the book had gone missing from under Rick's bed. It wasn't, Rick told himself, because they'd been avoiding talking about it. It was just that they hadn't had the chance. Now, though, he found his stomach tightening and his shoulders hunching, almost as if he was drawing in his defences. "About what?" he all but snapped. Scott glanced around. He lowered his voice as if afraid of being overheard. "About the mist. About how it's our fault." I don't see how it can be, said Thad a little whinily. He said it came up out of the hole we dug, said Scott, like poisonous gas or something. Who says it's poisonous? Said Rick quickly. Well, okay, not poisonous then, but I don't know. It's not natural, is it? Rick scowled. Yeah, well, what makes this doctor guy such an expert? I mean, we don't know anything about him. He seemed pretty crazy to me. I thought he was kind of cool, said Thad quietly. Rick made an exasperated sound. You think Einstein's cool? Well, he is, said Thad. Scott shook his head sadly as if there was no hope. Look, said Rick. The guy wanted the book and the book wasn't there, which pretty much means that this whole situation is out of our hands now, right? He thought briefly about his nightmare, which had somehow seemed more than a nightmare last night, in which the eyes of his Halloween costume had seemed to glow. But he quickly clamped down on the memory. Scott looked as if he wanted to say something more, but was reluctant to do so. Rick wasn't about to encourage him, but then Thad said, What's wrong, Scott? You look as though you need the toilet real bad. I heard some weird stuff happened last night, Scott blurted. Like what? Said Thad. Something happened to Dr. Clayton. He had some kind of accident? Something no one seems to want to talk about. Oh yeah, said Rick. And who told you this? I heard my mum talking to Mrs. Fisher on the phone, and she heard it from Mrs. Walsh. Apparently Mrs. Walsh says that whatever happened to old man Clayton, she'd never seen anything like it. Is he dead? Thad asked, eyes wide behind his spectacles. No, he's in hospital, but no one's allowed to visit him. Oh, he probably just got drunk and fell over and cracked his stupid head open, Rick said, then immediately regretted his use of the word stupid. Dr. Clayton wasn't stupid. He was just sad. Tragic, even. From what my mum was saying, it was freakier than that, said Scott. Yeah? Well, sometimes dumb rumours get spread around that aren't true. Come on, guys. Let's get that soda. The boys trooped past the stalls to the park entrance, each of them silent now. Rick was scowling, out of sorts. Not even the thought of the fun they'd be having that evening could cheer him up. In fact, there was a part of him that wished the Halloween carnival wasn't happening at all, a part of him that would be glad when it was over. They passed beneath the banner at the entrance. A voice hailed them as they did so. Hey, you guys, how's it going? Rick jumped, at first unable to identify the source of the voice. Then he realised it was coming from above his head and looked up. One of his neighbours, Mr. Everson, was at the top of a tall ladder, fixing some coloured lights to one of the wooden stanchions, across which the banner had been hung. Mr. Everson was a big, bearded guy with long, straggly hair, which flowed from beneath the brim of his Boston Red Sox cap. He had a hammer in his right hand, and a bunch of 6-inch nails sticking out of the breast pocket of his green and black lumberjack shirt. Hey, Mr. Everson, Rick shouted. We're just going for a soda. You want one? Mighty kind of you, Rick, but I got myself a flask of coffee right there in my bag. So, you boys going trick-or-treating tonight? Yes, sir, said Scott. I guess, said Rick with rather less enthusiasm. Well, you have a good time, you hear? Yes, sir, we will, said Rick. See you later, Mr. Everson. The boys turned out of the gate and set off up the road towards old Mr. Maxon's corner store. Mr. Maxon had a dog that used to scare them with its barking when they were younger, but which was a blind, mangy old thing now, barely able to raise a growl. They had gone no more than 20 metres when they heard a cry from behind them, abruptly cut off, and then the clatter of something falling to the ground. The three of them glanced at each other in alarm. That's Mr. Everson, said Rick. They ran back in the direction they had come. Although they had only walked a little way up the road, the park entrance had already been swallowed by mist. After a few seconds, however, it came into sight, and Rick scanned the ground, expecting to see his neighbour lying injured or unconscious, having fallen off his ladder. But there was no sign of him. Rick looked up. He wasn't at the top of his ladder either. "Where's he gone?" asked Scott pointlessly. "Dunno, but his hammer's there," said Thad, pointing. "That must have been what we heard hitting the ground." Rick approached the hammer, mystified. Questions ran through his mind. If Mr. Everson had fallen, why wasn't he here? If it was only his hammer he had dropped, where was he now? Why hadn't he picked it up? Even more disturbingly, why had he cried out? And why had the cry been suddenly cut off? He bent and reached for the hammer, and suddenly, as though alerted by his proximity, spidery threads of green light began to flicker around it, to dance up and down its handle and its metal head. Rick snatched his hand back, alarmed. "Wow!" cried Thad. "Did you see that?" Scott's eyes were wide with fear. "Where is Mr. Everson? What happened to him?" "I think he's been taken," said Rick. Taken where?" bleated Scott. But Rick could only look at him with eyes as fearful as Scott's own and shake his head. The Hovoken that had disappeared was gone for maybe 30 seconds. When it returned, unfolding from a bilious mass of glowing energy which formed in the air, it was not alone. It was accompanied by a bearded man in a baseball cap and lumberjack shirt, whose mouth was open in shock. The man staggered forward, as if shoved from behind, his head turning rapidly from left to right as he looked around him. He spotted Martha, and goggled at her in bewilderment. She was only sorry she couldn't smile or wave or offer him any words of encouragement. Then the man seemed to register his surroundings, and Martha saw the shock turn to fear on his face. It was several seconds, however, as though his mind could only handle one thing at a time, before he seemed to notice the Hovoken themselves. As soon as he did, he yelled out in panic and broke into a stumbling run. He clearly wasn't running with any particular goal in mind, but merely following his instincts and trying to get as far away as possible from the creatures around him. He had taken only a few steps when the Hovoken leader reached out a hand and sketched an intricate shape in the air. Instantly, the man froze in mid-step, held immobile. Martha saw the utter panic on his face and tried to convey calmness to him with her eyes, but he didn't even look at her. The Hovoken leader then drew a circular shape in the air before quickly spreading its taloned fingers in what Martha thought of as the kind of gesture that might be used to describe an explosion. Instantly, threads of green energy looped around the man like shimmering coils of rope and propelled him towards the wall of writhing black roots. To Martha's horror, the wall suddenly opened up like a huge toothless mouth, and the man disappeared, screaming, inside. The hole closed behind him like that of a massive predator closing on its prey, and his scream was abruptly cut off. A moment later, Martha heard another sound, a sound that, though she remained upright, turned her legs to jelly. It was the splintering crunch of bones.